If you're rated below 2000 elo and looking to improve your chess, then this is the video for you. Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we open with e4 and my opponent goes d6, known as the Pirc or the Pirc Defense. And basically everyone will recommend to play the move d4 here. Of course, black is offering the whole center, so normally you should oblige and take the whole center. However, I believe that that is essentially playing into exactly what black wants. And it looks like he's going for something known as a Czech Pirc. Czech as in the Czech Republic or Czechia, with c6, and most likely followed by g6, bishop g7 ideas. And basically, it's kind of like a small center approach from black, where he's controlling a lot of squares on the 5th rank, but so are we, right? So we're fighting over the 5th rank, essentially. And I don't like to play d4 here. I feel like that's exactly what black wants, exactly what black is expecting. So I'm going to play a Vienna setup with bishop to c4. And there's quite a lot of deadly traps we can set featuring this pawn on f7. And we may get a chance to show them, we may not. But I just don't want to play the move d4. Instead, I'd like to play something like d3 and f4, and basically say to black, you can push e5, because e5 is one of the main ideas of the Pirc, but I'm not going to be putting a pawn on d4 for you to try and open up lines in the center, right? Because in a lot of cases, after like d4, e5, not necessarily in this position, but there's lots of times where you get a trade and the queens trade off, and I do not want any part of that. So as predicted, my opponent goes pawn to g6, and we'll expand with the move f4. I will probably play d3, but I don't want to reveal it just yet. I mean, I also want to be a little bit flexible, because maybe I want to change my mind, but it's unlikely. Also, I play f4 because I want to put the knight behind the f-pawn. So I want to get the knight out, of course, but I want to do it in this fashion. And, okay, interesting, h6. So one of the big like sort of reasons for this setup is to try to clamp down on the d5 square. Now, in a lot of cases, black will play a move like knight to d7, maybe also bishop g4 pinning our knight, and essentially try to put as much pressure on e5 as possible, and then play the move e5. So I don't think we can really stop black from doing that, and I also don't care, because like I said, I'm gonna put the pawn on d3. By the way, what I was saying with some traps regarding the f7 pawn is, let's say here I was setting a trap of bishop to g4. How would we get a very winning position if bishop g4 here? Well, we go bishop to f7, king f7, and knight g5 check. The king has to move, and then we pick up the bishop, and all in all, we win the pawn on f7, and black can no longer castle, which is why my opponent goes h6 to stop any knight to g5 ideas. But, of course, this wastes a tempo, and I'm now going to play the move h3. Of course, I'm weakening this diagonal, but the e-pawn hasn't moved, so the queen doesn't have access to h4, so that's not a big deal. Black effectively has to trade. I mean, if he retreats, then that's a very sad bishop with no future, and my knight's pretty good. So he trades, and we'll take back with the queen. One of the things I really like about this trade as well is, you know how I mentioned that I want to clamp down on d5? Well, now I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 defenders on the d5 square. So d5 just isn't going to happen. And we even have the possibility of playing f5 here, supported by the queen, which looks incredibly tempting, I've got to say. But, if f5... Okay, what I'm thinking is, if I castle kingside, e5 is what I'm expecting. Of course, taking leads to knight takes with a fork, which would be ridiculous to allow. Maybe we have bishop f7. Maybe we have bishop f7? Castles e5, take, bishop f7. King d7. Well, I suppose we just move the queen, like to g3, and we're up a pawn. Yeah, that's actually fine. That's actually fine. What I was a little bit concerned about was if f5, which was my original plan, then my opponent could just push d5 and keep everything shut. But I think we can go ahead and take, because like I said, I don't think knight takes works because of bishop f7. I suppose king e7 is the only thing I have to be concerned about, which I initially missed because the e-pawn was there during my original calculation, which keeps pressure on the bishop. King f8 is not concerning because I'm just going to drop my queen back and we have all kinds of discoveries. So take king e7. I don't have bishop g5. My queen also has to remain defending the bishop, so queen to f2. And let's say queen f8. Well, I can just drop the queen back, the bishop back to b3. And also the knight doesn't have h6 to apply pressure. There's no rook that can come to f8 either to pin. So I think this works. And I mean, this looks incredibly dubious to be just leaving my queen and bishop on pre like this. But we're winning a pawn. The black king is going to have to move, of course. So black can no longer castle, and his king is stripped of all defenses. And I think queen f2, just a quiet move, getting out of harm's way. Yeah, king d7 is not concerning at all, because now I don't even have to stay on the f-file. I can just go to g3 instead and get completely out of the way, which I'm going to do, because now, if take, I can just take. If king to e7, then I wouldn't be able to go queen to g3, because then the knight takes, and if the rook takes, the king takes, and I go down a rook. So, yeah, I mean, it should be a pretty winning position, but of course, we are only up a pawn so far. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And we'll just get the bishop out of there. There's no need to go for any tactical complications with a move like d4, for example, which the engine may say that it prefers in this position. But something like, I don't know, knight takes, rook takes, and bishop takes d4 with check. I don't want any part of that. Let's just get the bishop out of there. I mean, b5 is a pretty typical Pirc move, but it seems like with a king on d7, I don't know if you want to be opening up the queen side like that. I see no reason not to just develop. Yeah, I mean, let's get the bishop to e3. I don't want to come to f4 because I never want to trade like this. I suppose I would have a queen g4 check, but I don't see why I want to activate the black bishop. I think I'd prefer to play a move like d4 and just kick the knight, because in fairness, the only square would probably be c4. But no, it looks like he's giving himself the g6 square, which is fine by me. Now we play d4, which my opponent, of course, spected all the way back on move 2. Yeah, and knight c4 will just take that off the board immediately. That is black's, well, one of black's 2 only good pieces. And now we have many options. We could try to blow open the center with the move e5. We could try to blow open the center with the move d5. Although, I don't know. I'm probably losing a pawn there. We could go rook to f7, which I think I prefer, because of course we attack the bishop and we prepare to double up. Also notice the weakness of the d6 pawn could come in handy. And whilst we're only up a pawn in this position, it's so much worse than that for black, because obviously his king is stranded. We have full central control, right, with our 2 central pawns now. And we dominate the only open file. We have a rook on the 7th rank. I'm expecting rook to f8 to try and get rid of this powerful rook. We could trade, force the bishop back, and then d5 looks pretty tempting. Also e5. I think I'm going to take. Of course, you could play a move like queen to f3, just adding another defender. But I like this because we get the bishop off of the very nice diagonal. And now we kind of have free reign to do what we want. So I would love e5, but I think d5 keeps things nice and shut for black, which is exactly what he wants. Similarly, if I go d5, he does have c5, but then I have e5 because we take away the d5 square from the black pawn. Actually, no, the queen does guard that. So maybe we just play rook to f6, attacking d6. That might be an easier option. If rook f6, knight g6, opening up the bishop's defense, then e5 is very well defended in that line. Very well defended. But actually, I suppose we could just go queen to f3 and double up on the f-file. Yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Alternatively, we could try to force d5. Again, if c5, e5, that looks very, very good. Although, again, I think my opponent can actually just go after the d5 pawn, so I'm not so sure. No, I'm going to go rook f6. I'm going to go rook f6. We also take away the e6 square from the queen, which is potentially useful. I think for the time being, I'd like to not make any pawn moves in the center, because, of course, whenever a piece moves or a pawn advances, it leaves spaces behind, right? It no longer controls certain squares. Okay, now the situation has changed. Instead of knight g6, the more active approach, my opponent plays the more passive knight to c8. Of course, he's overprotecting the d6 pawn, but I don't care so much anymore about winning d6. I just want to open up the position. So now the knight has abandoned d5. Now we will push d5 ourselves. Either we will take and blast open the king's position, or if c5 trying to keep things shut, then we have e5, and my opponent doesn't have d5 to keep things locked up. And the point is that with the knight on g6, if this knight was on g6 right now, let's imagine, then after c5, e5, of course the knight could just take and keep everything closed, which is why I initially rejected the move d5 after rook f6 and knight to g6, right? But now the situation has changed after the move knight to c8. So I hope that makes sense and can kind of like illustrate when making a pawn break is a good idea and when it isn't. Because, of course, I want to tear open the center because the king is on d7. Like, the king is wide open. But we've got to do it in the correct manner. So, okay, my opponent attacks my rook with bishop to e7. You may be tempted to go rook e6, which is my first thought. However, then I can't take because the rook would hang. So we could start by taking on d6, sorry, on c6 with check. So after king takes, then I suppose we have to retreat the rook. Alternatively, we could play queen to g4 check. Let's say king c7, which looks like the most natural move. Then maybe rook to e6 makes more sense because we can take because this is hit. However, after queen g4, king c7, rook to e6, we're not actually threatening anything. And h5 looks scary. We do have queen to f5, though. If g4, I don't know, it looks a bit unnecessary to be allowing that much counterplay. So, what if we just go rook to f5 instead? Basically stopping h5 because we have 3 attackers and black only has 2 defenders, right? So if rook f5, we're still ready to take. If push, we can still push. And also the knight no longer has access to e7 to apply pressure to the rook and force the rook away. So this makes a lot of sense to me, this move. So obviously, I've shown why I've rejected this, why I've rejected this, and why I've rejected this. I had a recent coaching call that's actually published on the channel with a 500 ELO player. And I was saying to him, like, when you're thinking about moves in chess, you might have 2, 3, 4 moves you're considering. Here, I had 1, 2, 3, 4 moves that I was considering, right? It's not so much a case of find the one you like the most and play it. To me, the way to discard, well, to choose which one you actually want to go for is to actually try to disprove each one, right? So as we saw, I firstly, I believe, disproved rook e6. I disproved rook e6, proved it to be a bad move because I didn't like the fact that I couldn't take because the queen was hitting the rook. So I discarded that. Then I wanted to play here. But then I actually thought that I wasn't doing myself any favors, and after king takes, I feel like I'm actually just helping black out there. Then I wanted to go queen g4, king c7, rook to e6, but then I disproved that because I was like, well, actually h5 is pretty scary. So by disproving my other three candidate moves, I arrived at the conclusion that actually this one makes the most sense. So I hope that is useful for you guys, that like frame of thinking. And yes, c5 is a move that we absolutely want to see, because now we're going to hit my opponent with the move e5. And this is a killer move, because what this d-pawn is essentially doing, or has done by not forcing, but encouraging the move c5, is my one pawn has locked down both of black's central pawns. And now the other pawn comes into the game, and black cannot move his d-pawn unless he is to take, in which case, thank you very much, I will happily open up the position. And if black does nothing, then I probably push and just have a protected passed d-pawn, which looks horrific for black to deal with. So the only line that I want to consider is we don't actually have to take this pawn. If we take with a rook, then just bishop to d6 and we get skewered, so we can discard that very quickly. If queen e5, bishop to d6, queen to f6, if the bishop goes back to e7, we have queen c6 check, which is very nice. So I think on that basis, I will happily play queen e5, because that's the only line that I'm concerned about. And yeah, we just infiltrate with queen f6. We could, of course, force a queen trade if we want, but I think it's actually simpler to try to attack my opponent right now, because he isn't creating any form of counterplay. The only thing I don't like about my position is my bishop. I don't think it's a very good piece. It's kind of vulnerable to queen e8, but I suppose we can just drop it back to f2, and it monitors e1, monitors e3. And actually, the bishop on f2 is a useful piece, because it will be monitoring these two squares, and the knight is monitoring these two squares, preventing the queen from infiltrating. Okay, knight e7. Not a move I really considered, but it's just a one-move threat. We can just drop the rook back. That's not a problem. Also, we're hitting the rook, bear in mind, which is very useful. It makes it so this queen will struggle to move. Because, like, let's say here, my opponent tries knight takes. You can't do that. Because after knight takes, queen takes, you hang your rook, which is very good news for us. To be fair, though, even if black could get away with this, I refuse to believe it works. And I believe that's a free rook. Yeah, there's no counterplay. The best black can do is queen takes c2, but that holds no threat. So my opponent eventually buckles under the pressure. I mean, like, what can black do? How can black move? Maybe rook to h7 is a move, but I mean, after something like... I suppose it does stop knight b5 ideas, because there is queen takes defending the bishop, which is interesting. But, yeah, of course, this is completely winning. My opponent attacks my bishop. I can just drop it back. That's not a problem. You could try and be fancy and sacrifice a rook. Or, well, sack the exchange. But why would I do that? What we have now is this interesting relationship between the knight and the bishop, where my bishop, you can see, dominates all of the knight's forward movement, right? This is a very common theme that I talk about a lot on the channel, because it helps to just... what's the word? Like, reassure you that, like, this knight is not creating any counterplay, because we control all of its moves, because I know this relationship. And my opponent offers me a queen trade, which I'm obviously going to accept. Then I think we actually have a really... oh, we would have a really cool move with bishop c5, rook to f7, check, picking up the knight, except that bishop c5 comes with check, so we do not. Instead, we'll just go knight to e4, which attacks the bishop and attacks c5 for a second time, which is obviously just very good. I will happily win another pawn. You may be tempted to play a move like bishop to e3, going after rook f7, but it's not necessary. Okay, bishop infiltrates. No, I'm actually going to take here with the bishop, because if knight takes, it comes with a check, but after king 2 d6, the only way to defend the pawn is rook d1, and I'd rather not have my rook tied down like that. Instead, by taking with the bishop, we maintain like a force field around the king, so it just can't get close to the pawn. Of course, this bishop can't hit the pawn because it's on the wrong color complex, and this knight would have to like reroute to e7 or something, or f6 or c7, but we could just push it if we really want. Yeah, let's go pawn to g3, supported by the knight, because I want my rook to have access to everything on the f-file. I like my knight on e4 as well, because it controls this knight's immediate forward movement. We can't stop knight to c7, but that's not a big deal. If bishop to e5, I like the look of rook to f7. And as I said, we've created this force field against the king, so the king would be forced back onto the back rank, which, I mean, worst case scenario, we can pick up a7, and best case scenario, I don't know, maybe we can do even better. So let's deliver this check. And my opponent's, of course, trying to trade pieces, which we'll happily do, but we can actually just win way more material by first forcing the king away from the defense of the bishop, and my opponent resigns, because either you go bishop e7 and lose a piece like this, or your king goes back to d8 or c8, and then we can just take, and we're up way too much material. So very interesting game. Let's jump into the analysis. And yeah, that was pretty damn solid. So a very nice 91.7% accuracy for us on the game review. My opponent with 81.0. Let's go through the game, and hopefully I can convince you to play this Vienna setup, by the way. I'm going to link this as part of my Vienna playlist, because we are effectively displaying the exact same ideas, but obviously my opponent doesn't go e5 into a normal Vienna. And I've got loads of games on my channel featuring the Vienna Game, the Vienna Gambit, which we're borrowing ideas from in this game. So d6, we go knight to c3. The main lines, of course, d4 or knight to f3, e5, d4, all very standard stuff. I don't want to go into any of these lines where your opponent offers you like a trade of queens, and yes, the black king can't castle, but this is boring. This is so boring. So my opponent goes pawn to c6. Again, the computer's begging for d4, but I'm going to go bishop to c4, which it calls an inaccuracy, but I don't actually care, to be honest. I think the best line for black to have gone for here was knight to f6, because then he's actually threatening to play d5, because he has 1, 2, 3 defenders of d5, and we have 1, 2, 3 attackers. So if we play a lazy move like f4 here, then my opponent hits me with d5, and the problem is I don't have the move e5 to keep the center locked, because of course, something like take, black is up a pawn and completely winning, really. And we can't retreat our bishop because we just lose the e-pawn. So I have had games before where here you go bishop to b3, so that if d5 does happen, then we have e5, and we actually have a really nice position here. So my opponent didn't go for that. He went g6. Again, the computer wants d4 or knight to f3, or bishop b3 to be fair, but I go f4 instead. Here, the computer suggests d5 and wants to sack a pawn. Okay, not going to lie, this... I suppose it tries to invalidate the placement of the pawn on f4 by getting rid of its partner. But I'm not going to lie, this looks very bad for black. I can probably actually go d4 now and just create a bind on the 5 square. I don't see how the computer recommends this. So we're going to ignore that. Bishop to g7. Again, if knight to f6, going for the same idea, we can go e5, but I would play the move bishop to b3. And again, d5, we meet with e5. Exact same idea. So bishop g7, though. Knight to f3. H6. And here the computer, again, wants d4. But I don't want to play that. I go d3, which is the structure that I want to get. My opponent goes bishop g4. Like I said, we're setting a trap here with knight to f3. Because if bishop g4, as I mentioned during the game, we have bishop f7 check. If the king moves, of course, we just drop the bishop back. So if the king takes, then we have knight g5 check. Now, it's important that the e-pawn hasn't been pushed yet, because let's say bishop g4, d3, e5, and then we tried to go for this. Now it no longer works, because after king takes and knight to g5 check, the queen can sacrifice herself on g5, because if we take, then bishop d1, king d1, and all in all, we are down a piece for a pawn. We lost the knight and the bishop, and our queen. My opponent lost his queen and his bishop, right? So you have to be careful, but here it wouldn't be a problem because nothing is watching g5, knight g5, the king would move, we'd take the bishop, and we would be up a pawn with an insanely dominant position. And the black king can't castle. So h6 played, I assume, to stop these ideas from ever happening. We go d3, again the computer wants d4, I don't care. Bishop g4 now. And here, I would normally castle. However, we have a good opportunity here to play the move h3, because if the bishop retreats, let's say to d7, then how are you developing this knight? That looks miserable. I will castle. Let's say knight to f6. I have e5 here. But even if I don't have e5, I just have an insanely pleasant position. I can play a4 to clamp down on b5, which is a common idea in the Pirc. And I can just slowly choose which pawn break I want to go for, right? So bishop f3 is essentially forced. Queen f3. And now, as I said, we completely clamp down on the d5 square. Black is not playing d5. My opponent goes knight d7. We just castle. And here, I was expecting the move e5, which is exactly what my opponent played. Now, the initial reason... So initially, I was going to play f5, right? I ended up rejecting this because I felt like we needed more preparation to make this work. And the computer agrees because there's just knight to e5, right? And we get forked. So, I castle, and I'm expecting the move e5 because that is a normal Pirc move, and my opponent goes for it. Now, initially, I was thinking, well, if we play the move f5 here, then my opponent has g5, and he's actually locked up the position really nicely, and I can't get through. So I played fe5, which is a great move. Apparently, bishop f7 is playable, which I didn't even consider. fe5 discovered check. Oh, yeah, that's really smart. If the king moves, we have mate. So the only move is for a knight to block, and then we win back the piece. And we're up a pawn, which is very interesting. I didn't consider that. But taking is also equally good. Knight takes, and here we take the plunge with bishop f7. Of course, you can't take because you get mated. So king d7, I thought was very unambitious. I thought king e7 was the best move by far, because now I don't have queen g3 because knight takes f7. And to be fair, after queen to g6, bishop f6, blocking this, the computer does think I'm better, but there's no need to be down a piece for 2 pawns. If king e7, I was going to go queen to f2, just keeping an eye on the bishop. And after queen to f8, then I drop the bishop back, trade the queens. And black is, of course, down a pawn with a worse position, something like knight to f6, bishop e3, rook f8, rook f1. This is, you know, pretty normal play. Very similar to what happened in the game, except, of course, the queens are off the board. But king to d7 allows queen to g3, because now the bishop is very well defended. Taking, of course, makes no sense because you lose a bishop. So my opponent goes knight to e7, and we just bring the bishop right back. Bishop to b3. b5 played, and we go bishop to e3, getting the bishop out. Which, of course, just develops the bishop and connects the rooks. My opponent goes g5. In retrospect, bishop f4 might have been a decent idea, with the point of trying to take the knight and then clear up the f7 square. But, I mean, the best move is queen b6 here. But let's say black even plays a move like g5, for example. Well, taking makes no sense, and you can see the evaluation drop massively. Because now, you can kind of see that we could get an opposite-coloured bishop endgame, which, of course, why would I ever want that? So I have to give a check. I can invade with rook f7, and realistically, I'm still going to be completely winning here. But this is just unnecessary to allow black such a good bishop, stopping d4. So bishop e3, let's keep the bishop pair. g5, we go d4, kicking the knight, knight c4. I was expecting knight 5 to g6 here, trying to keep more pieces on the board, but I suppose my bishop is very, very strong. So, of course, we trade because this knight was hitting a lot of different things, and it was a very good piece. And rook f7. So the computer prefers queen g4. And, okay, my opponent would not realistically play king to e8. King c7 looks far more natural. And then rook f7. Oh, okay, so I think the point is, because here my opponent went queen g8, I think the point is that if I start with queen g4, king c7, and then rook f7, then you don't have queen f7 because the knight is hanging, right? Whereas if in this position I deliver the check, then the king has the d8 or the e8 square to go to, whereas previously you don't. I mean, you do have e8, but then the queen can't get over to help. So to me, this is no good. But okay, queen g8, rook a to f1, rook f8. Black has to try and trade, and the computer does like this move. The other move I was considering was queen to f3, but the computer hates this, allowing all these trades. Oh, wait, there you would hang a bishop, so something like rook g8, and we're still better, of course, but it's better to take. So we force the bishop to take, and then rook f6 is the best move. And to be fair, knight c8 is the best response. I was expecting knight g6, because now d5, c5, e5 makes no sense, because we just hang the pawn. And the computer doesn't care. It finds this cool tactic where we win the pawn back, but I don't want any of that. So knight c8, we go d5, which is the best move, and bishop to e7. And now, so I played the move rook f5. The computer actually preferred my other two options, interestingly. Now, what I couldn't figure out was how we continue the attack here. Oh, okay, the computer finds an absolutely disgusting move. What? Queen e5. The pawn is pinned. And we sacrifice the rook, give a check, and if the king moves, we give another check. If the king moves, then we take on f6 with check and win the queen. If the knight blocks, then we take here. If the king goes here, then it's mate. If the king goes here, then he gets forked. And if the king goes here, then he gets forked. Okay, obviously I'm never finding that. So on that basis, I quite like the move rook to f5. c5, and of course e5 breaking open the center. de5. Here the computer wants this, and after this, oh, we do have queen g4 check. Ah, okay, I missed that, and then we can go rook e6. So that's quite cool. But queen e5 is still good. Bishop d6, queen to f6. And here, of course, my opponent went knight to e7, hitting the rook. Here the computer wants to sacrifice the rook. And if king to e7, keeping hold of the bishop, then we give a check. Wait, what's the point? The king is keeping an eye on the bishop. I'm playing the top computer moves right now. It wants bishop f2. Okay, well, this is obviously ridiculous. There's no need to go for this, so we just drop the rook back. And then after queen g6, we win a rook. But I thought rook h7 was the best move, which it is, trying to be resilient. And here, there's not an obvious way in, but one of the moves I would like to play is knight to e4. However, I thought queen takes d5. Sorry, yeah, queen takes d5, and the bishop is defended. And here we have to find queen back to f3, setting up this massive fork. And if rook f7, sacking the rook, if the king moves, rook d1, and the bishop hangs anyway. So, yeah, there's a lot of tactics there, to be fair. Realistically, I'm not sure I would have gone for this. I might have played a slower move like rook e1, or maybe rook d1, trying to set this up. And then black's best idea is to try to trade queens with me, which, yeah, I suppose the engine thinks that maybe black can hold this, but I'm very doubtful. Very, very doubtful. But queen g6, of course, hangs the rook. Knight f5 hitting the bishop. We drop the bishop back. And then my opponent offers me a queen trade, which I've got to say I do not understand. Here I really wanted to play this. And after this, give this check. The computer actually likes this. Wait. If this? What's the point? Here. G4. Yeah, whatever. I don't care. That's so dumb. But we go knight e4, bishop moves, we take with the bishop, not the knight, because, I mean, I don't want to have to play rook d1 to defend. So bishop c5, knight e8, g3, kicking the bishop, and of course, we could trade, but rook f7 is even better, and my opponent resigns, because as I said, either the bishop blocks and we win the bishop, or the king moves, and then we win everything anyway. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was very instructive. And hopefully you enjoyed some of the tactics and ideas in this Vienna structure. If you want to see another game where we play a pure Vienna, so a pure Vienna would be e4, e5, knight to c3. Many of the same ideas still apply. Check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.